given the ordering of the contemporary political landscape on the globe by states, by nations, and the necessity of statehood, and indeed the necessity of a certain degree of sovereign jurisdiction and sovereign territorial integrity that is eroding. So I may have missed your question a little bit, but I think mostly I'm just agreeing with you that is an important way to read them. Did you want to add a little something here? Okay. So now let me go to Engin's to these questions about Mumford and Zizek. I prefer Mumford, but I'll tarry with Zizek. I agree, and in fact, I tried to hint at this toward the very end of my remarks, that the walls in most cases. No, let me back up. The claim that you offered from Mumford is that the wall is not about the outside, but is actually a reminder is a sign or signification to the inside about what is outside. Put another way, the wall is a site of production of identity, really important site of identity. And it is also a particular way of configuring the identities on both sides of the wall. And one of the chapters of this book devotes itself to the ways in which walls radically reconfigure identities in the case where, for example, globalization is producing a draw of cheap labor or a draw of contraband goods, or where colonization is producing an ongoing set of skirmishes about land and about sovereignty. And the ways that walls actually effectively remake those conflicts and remake the identities of those conflicts into conflicts that have very different qualities of enmity. So that, for example, in the case of the U.S.-Mexico wall, what the wall does, I think rhetorically quite successfully, is remake an image of a nation that is not radically dependent upon cheap and illegal labor, but instead is being invaded by those who would steal our nation from us, who would steal our goods from us, who would steal our jobs and our wealth and our schools and our healthcare system, such as it isn't, and so forth. And that is exactly what the wall is very effective in doing rhetorically. Surely, I mean, so much has been written about the West Bank Wall in this respect that I don't need to repeat it. That said, what is important, I think, is to understand how differently walls signify at different times and different places across history. So that on one level, while one wants to make claims about what walls do, on another level, it's really important to see the difference in how medieval walls dotting the European countryside literally staked out or produced a certain sense of the city against, or the town, in the context of a vast countryside, and marked it as distinct. At the same time, often functioned as at least modest barricades against ordinary economic siege or plunder that happens between towns or between fiefdoms, and at the same time produces identity, produces a sense of who we are as a city that is different from, for example, the wall between Palestine and Israel, or even the wall between pick another wall. It's really different to have a city wall marking out a space of concentrated village life from a vast agricultural open space than it is to have walls dividing urban populations, or walls dividing first and third world populations, or walls dividing India off from its slightly poorer neighbors. So I don't want to quite make the claim. In fact, I don't want to make the claim that all walls are doing the same thing. And one of the reasons for writing a book about what I'm calling the new walls, the walls of the 90s and the aughts, is precisely to understand what they are doing that is different from the walls earlier in the 20th century, and also medieval walls, and also the Greek and Roman walls, and the Great Wall of China. And every time I give this talk, somebody says, "What about my wall?" And there's always somebody who's got a wall either I haven't heard of or that I haven't thought about. And I'm not a scholar of walls, obviously. I'm trying to think about 21st century citizenship, identities, and governance, and sovereignty. So I accept the idea that you've offered from Mumford, that walls are very often not about what they repel, but are rather about producing a particular kind of identity inside. And in fact, in many cases, I would even go further and say they are precisely about purifying and cleansing a certain kind of national identity of its less lovely needs and implicatedness in the global economy, or of its colonial status, or of its own immigrant heritage, or whatever. It is precisely about producing a fiction of the pure, homogeneous, law-abiding citizen that makes up, that is the citizen or citizenry of the nation that is walled in, and exporting all of its ills or its troubles to an imagined outside. In that sense, I guess I will go along with Zizek on this particular issue. that nationhood is very much, especially today, if it has remaining conceits. One of those conceits is the idea that we are an us, which others, and have goods that others would steal. Now, that's obviously can't be true of every nation, but it is certainly true of many of the nations walling. Finally, I want to say that for me, one of the really interesting things about the last 2 years, anticipating the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, has been the enormously interesting literature written on the psychic and social identity produced on both sides of the Berlin Wall. And there have been some scholars in particular who have recalled for us that the Berlin Wall was not originally designed as a wall intended to imprison an East German population, but rather was a wall originally designed to produce a secure space for the social and psychological and economic experimentation to produce communism that was understood to be so fragile and so vulnerable should it be infected by the West that it couldn't survive. Now, that history, that's not the sole story of the Berlin Wall, obviously, but it is telling that when most of us think about the Berlin Wall today, all we can think about is the figure of the imprisonment, and that the idea of producing that kind of a space vanishes. But it's also important to remember what happens with a wall that is produced to protect an inside, no matter what the inside and no matter what the auspices, which is that it always produces something of a walled personality or persona or imaginary, no matter what. And the literatures that are coming out on the so-called walled personality of the East German, to me, seem really useful for thinking about the impulse or the impetus to wall liberal democracies today, because they are real warnings to just what kind of walling takes shape in the psyche and in the social imaginary, even as the walls being built today are so often imagined to be protective walls for liberal democracy, how easily they can flip and actually become prisons. And of course, many Israelis, left Israelis and Palestinians have written about the Israeli wall in the same way. That was much too long-winded. I'll be shorter-winded with the other questions, I promise.